Has anyone actually seen in person at a wedding any people who have objected? What's the story? Story 1. Incredibly anticlimactic, an ex-boyfriend stood up and said he was still in love with the bride, so the wedding couldn't go ahead. Officant said that wasn't a valid reason. He sat back down. Story 2. I saw this once. The pastor is asking this, and people are looking around 2/3 of the way back, is a very pregnant young lady standing up. People start to turn to look at her. She say, "I'm sorry, I have to pee." That was as a close one. Story 3. There wasn't an objection, but my cousin's rehearsal dinner was nuts. The bride and the maid of honor were both pregnant by the groom and the best man, but vice versa of what you think. It all came to a head because the best man spoke up that the wedding was a bad idea. Story 4. My sister had her wedding in our backyard. When asked if there are objections, the family dog got up, walked to the minister, barked once, turned back and sat down. Story 5. I was shooting a wedding video. The preacher gets to that part, and just as he says, "Or forever hold your peace," there was a huge peal of thunder. Lighting had hit a TV tower on the other side of the valley. I'd seen the strike and had just enough time to think, that's going to be loud, and cover my ears. After the thunder died away, there was a long pause and the preacher said, "Well, that's never happened before." It was awesome. Fake, they're still married. Story 6. So kinda, but not really. I was maid of honor at my best friend's wedding, and her dad had some mental health issues along with a tendency to be annoying. I knew that when the groom had asked her dad for permission to marry her, he had technically said no. So we were all on pins and needles a bit. The time came for the "does anyone object" question, and the dad steps up to speak, and I watch my friend's face go completely ashen, and I'm ready to throw up or throw hands or something. And the dad says, "Growing up, bride's name always hated this song, and we always joked that we'd sing it at her wedding, so here it is." And he and her mother proceed to sing the song, while I bore a hole in his face with my eyes, and a few of the guests try to force awkward courtesy chuckles. It was awful. Story 7. Funny story. My oldest sister was getting married for the 3rd time. The first 2 were big weddings, but this one was small, just immediate family. The rehearsal was immediately before the ceremony. The pastor came out to talk us through what would happen and when and what our cues for participation would be. At one point he said, "And here I will ask if you will love and support them as a couple, and you respond." From the front row, Dad boomed, "No." The pastor looked stricken. Dad explained, "She's 42 years old. She can support herself." Family, include the bride, laughed. The pastor then explained he was talking about spiritual support, not financial, which, of course, Dad knew fully well. Cut to the actual ceremony, about 15 minutes later. The pastor was actually wincing as he came up to the fateful question, "Will you love and support Judith and Clark in their lives together?" The relief was palpable as everyone said yes. But then the pastor realized that there was another question right after this one that he forgot about earlier. Again, you could see it on his face as he made a decision. His next line went like this: "Is there anyone here who objects to this union? Dearly beloved, let us pray." I was cracking up as quietly as I could for the rest of the service, and Dad had an impish smile all day. Oh yes, the best part of the ceremony was the amateur bagpipe player who couldn't keep all of his chanters going. So when he played Amazing Grace at the end, he'd have to hit the bag repeatedly, making it go whamp each time. Story 8. The groom's dad stood up and loudly said, "It's not too late, son," right as the bride was coming down the aisle. She sobbed the whole way down and the show went on. They're divorced now. Story 9. So fun fact, the whole objecting to the wedding thing was not done to give someone an opportunity to object if they didn't approve of the wedding. It was done to give someone a chance to object if they knew the couple can't be married. Dates back to a time long ago when public records were non-existent, sparse. Small communities might be pretty isolated from others. Many marriages were arranged, and people only met near the wedding, etc. So asking this question wasn't a chance for an old boyfriend to proclaim his undying love. It was a time for great-grandma to stand up and let everyone know that actually, the bride and groom were first cousins by that floozy of a daughter who ran off to the big city 30 years ago that nobody talks about. Or for Joe the farmer from 2 counties over to stand up and inform everyone that the groom was actually already married and had abandoned his family and moved to set up a new life. Things like that. So it was more about, it would be a violation of government church laws if these people got married. Not so much, I don't want these people to get married. Story 10. Was at a wedding years ago when the question was asked, the bride's father stood up and asked her, "Are you absolutely sure you want to marry this guy?" Since the back 2 rows on the groom's side had a bet on this, we all were then cleared to start drinking. To be fair, they are still married and still in love, and her dad still hates the man because he works for himself and not a company. Her dad hates that he has a successful business. Story 11. The night before my cousin's wedding, her ex showed up to her parents' house with the intention of making an 11th hour plea for her not to go through with the wedding and take him back instead. Luckily, she was out with her sisters dropping the cake off at the hotel for the reception, so she didn't have to deal with it, and my uncle eventually got the guy to leave, threatened to call the police in the end. The next morning at the church, there were a load of guests very discreetly put on the alert that this guy could show up and try to disrupt things. Luckily, the wedding went off without a hitch, but we found out later that he actually had turned up at the church, but the sacristan had been standing just outside the door and clocked him heading in and managed to hold him off in the car park. Apparently, it was just getting to the point that the sacristan was worried the ex was about to make a dash for the church when a car pulled up and three of his friends got out and kind of talked him down and then took him away. Story 12. When I officiated for my friends, I phrased it as, "If there's anyone here who may I object to this marriage, you had a decade to make your opinion known, so can it." Story 13. Not an objection during ceremony, but right before. My old maid great aunt told me as I was about to go down the aisle, I didn't have to do it. I did it anyway, shook violently through the ceremony, and the marriage was over in less than 2 years. Here's the thing about old maid aunts. They are very keen observers of humankind, and therefore many are single by choice lol. Story 14. Not a wedding, but a proposal. Back in my mid-20s when I was single, I was a bartender at a fancy steakhouse in my city. Valentine's Day was always a sellout night. I randomly had that night off, so a coworker of mine and I ponied up to the bar for a few free drinks before going out for the night. Place was jamming busy. Suddenly, this dude shouts for the whole restaurant's attention from the middle of the dining room. Place gets church quiet lickety-split. He gets down on one knee and pulls out a Rin. She lets him get through his whole spiel before literally laughing in his face and saying, "No, no, 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 no," and hightailing it out of there. Guy kind of climbs back into his chair dejected. Owner of the restaurant walks over with a highball glass, literally fills it with whiskey, pats him on the back and goes, "Dinner's on us, bud." Restaurant slowly went back to normal. Apparently, the guy didn't leave for like 2 more hours. Story 15. I wasn't there personally. A good friend was. Guy waited until the very end, almost before the officiant called, "I pronounce you," because there wasn't actually a part where they said, "if anyone objects." So the guy marrying them is about to pronounce them husband and wife, and some dude stands up from the back and shouts, "I object! You can't marry him, Sheila." Fake name. The officiant looked around, looked at the bride, and she just looked at the officiant and said, "You were saying?" And the wedding went on. The officiant said the last words, they kissed, and the guy starts yelling, "How could you do this to me? We should be together." The bride whispered to the groom whispered to the groomsman, and the groomsmen all headed down the aisle together. They didn't make it 3 feet before the yelling guy got out of his pew and ran out of the church. They followed him for good measure, but I guess he really left. At the reception, the bride's mom went around explaining that the guy had been a family friend, who the parents used to joke that him and the bride would get married, but stopped about the time the kids started school because it made the daughter mad. The guy never got the memo that it was a joke and basically considered her his betrothed. Nothing anyone could say to him would convince him that she was not going to marry him. He'd never done anything illegal, so she couldn't get a restraining order or anything. He was just obsessed. They didn't know how he found out about the wedding because they had kept the details away from him. Even his parents, who were still great family friends, didn't know the time and place and weren't going to be there because they didn't want to chance him ruining it. They had security, but only for the reception. They didn't think they'd need it for the church, but they were wrong. And when I asked what the bride whispered to the groom and what the groom whispered to the groomsman, that's him. Story 16. My favorite is from when this question was asked before and I can't find the comment. But I'll give the gist. F22-ish is marrying a guy same-ish age that she's known for years. Her little sister, 8-ish, basically knew him her whole life. She called him her best friend and said they were going to get married. During the wedding, the question was asked, and it was dead quiet, so almost everyone heard the lil sis object under breath. Pretty wholesome. Story 17. It wasn't exactly on that moment where a dude got up and walked over to the bride. And when I say walk, it was more like a duck waddle. He looked her straight in the eye and proclaimed, "I pooped my pants." Could be awful, but he was the happy couple's toddler son. They took a short break while one of his grandfathers changed him. It was a good laugh. Story 18. Well, it wasn't technically an objection, I think. It was my uncle and his fiancée. For context, he is a woman abuser. He is a violent, alcoholic, drug-addicted man-child. He is a felon who has spent a lot of time in jail for domestic violence. He can barely keep a job because he's lazy. He had already been violent with his fiancée. It was a very tiny wedding, like maybe 15 people in attendance or something. The mom of the bride is hysterically sobbing in her seat. As soon as they say, "I do," she throws herself back and starts motioning a stabbing motion to her heart, and someone has to pick her up and take her away. It was a whole lot. Story 19. Guy stood up and said he had fucked the bride a few months prior. Then another guy got up and said the same. It was some "I'm Spartacus" going on as another, and another stood up. Turns out she'd been making the rounds through this guy's family. None of them were going to say anything, but one guy cracked, and it was enough for the guilt to overflow on the rest, including the best man who was bright fucking red in the face when he stammered out that he had two, not but a 2 weeks prior. Open bar though, so that was nice. Story 20. Ex-girlfriend of the groom was also the bride's cousin and not happy. Wore a borderline scandalous red dress to the wedding. You could see her waiting for the moment, but the bridal party had already paid off the minister to skip, if anyone here has any objections. When the minister said, "You may now kiss the bride," and she realized she wasn't getting a chance, she stormed out, down the middle aisle stomping her heels. But the organist was playing, people were clapping for the couple, and she never got her moment. Story 21. Not an objection, but definitely an awkward moment. One of my uncles was getting married, and his soon-to-be wife wasn't quite as well liked by certain members of our family. She was more liberal than some others. She was seen as dramatic or eccentric, etc. I don't remember the exact words, but during the vows she was making comments about their cats and something about musical theater, and was pretty emotional. One of my other uncles said, not quite under his breath, "Jesus, good luck, man," when it was dead silent. It made my stepdad chuckle, and my mom and my aunt gave them the dirtiest looks. They got divorced a few years later because my uncle is trash. I felt bad for her because I really liked her, but she's honestly doing much better without him. Story 23. Not exactly. 40+ years ago, at a cousin's wedding, when the vows were being said, "Till death do you part," a loud "Ha!" came from the back, from the bride's sister's husband. The bride and groom were divorced about 6 months later. The brother-in-law was also in, but it took the sister longer to decide to divorce him. Story 24. Wasn't me, but my parents. They were getting married in a registry office, waiting in the ante-room for the previous wedding to end. They were very surprised to see 3 policemen run in and cart the groom away in handcuffs for bigamy. Bigamist or not, they never found out. The dude had already paid the photographer, so he stayed around and shot my parents' wedding for free. Story 25. In Australia, the paperwork you fill out a minimum of 1 month before the wedding takes care of any legal objections, already married, kinship, etc. No one is allowed to object on grounds of being butthurt. The question is not asked. Story 26. Not an objector, but the bride started crying instead of saying "I do." It was an arranged marriage, in a deeply conservative society. She was getting forced into it. The priest just shut the prayer book and walked off. The whole church erupted. There were some fistfights. Apparently the groom's family felt humiliated and cheated. Story 27. I used to be a wedding photographer. The groom objected, told everyone gathered that the bride had been fucking his best friend for quite some time. He just wanted to gather them all together to tell them about it. He then proceeded to punch on with the best man outside the church. I didn't get paid beyond the deposit they provided, but it was a memorable job. Up there with the TV news anchorman with bongs on every table. Story 28. My sister has diagnosed borderline personality disorder amongst other things. She's been engaged 4 times but never married. At her last engagement party, my mother turns up drunk. She's a very sloppy drunk. The groom's mother makes a speech about how she hopes they have a beautiful life together. When my mom yells, "It doesn't matter anyway, she won't go through with it, she never does." To be fair, they recently broke up, so she wasn't wrong. Story 29. My grandmother told me of a wedding ceremony she was at where this happened. North of Ireland, Catholic Church, 1970s. The priest asked if anyone knew of any lawful impediment to the marriage, and a beautifully dressed woman in her 30s stood up and said she had something to say. The priest invited her and the wedding couple into the sacristy to discuss her objection, and half an hour later he came back with just the couple, and the ceremony continued without any explanation or comment. The other woman left via the sacristy door, and my gran never ever heard a single word about what had happened during those 30 minutes. Story 30 kind of, but during the reception. When my friend got married, she intentionally didn't ask her dad to make a speech, knowing he didn't approve of the groom, and during the reception, he got rip-roaring drunk and snatched the microphone out of the DJ's hands and made one anyway. He went on for a good few minutes about how the groom was trash, and his daughter could do much better before several of her cousins managed to wrestle the microphone away from him and get him into a car to take him back to the hotel. It was super cringy. Story 31. So, kind of? My friend, who was much too young to be getting married, had fallen for a 27-year-old man at age 16. I seriously don't know how this guy didn't wind up in jail. This was in the 90s. But anyway, she got pregnant and he proposed. Her father, whom she rarely saw and lived 200 miles away, agreed to sign off on the paperwork to allow them to marry, mostly because he was very religious and didn't want his grandchild born out of wedlock. Her mother was out of the picture entirely. Well, that was in May, and by July she had miscarried. She was sad. Everyone was sad for her. But the end result was that they postponed any plans to get married that summer. The marriage license expired. Honestly, we all felt like she dodged a bullet there. Christmas rolls around, and my friend, now 17 and a senior in high school, had moved in with her boyfriend. They decide to get married on New Year's Eve. Right before the wedding, both her parents come rushing in to inform the minister that they did not consent to this wedding and that the bride was underage and her consent form was expired. The bride started crying like a toddler, screaming at her parents that they were ruining her life. They had abandoned her. Why did they get to decide anything? She was honoring the wishes of her dead child here. All kinds of drama. The bride cried and carried on until she had mascara running down and staining her rented wedding dress. No wedding took place that night, but she still married him anyway the next summer when she turned 18. They were divorced by the time she was 20, and she had 2 babies to take care of. The guy turned out to be a cheating deadbeat in a shocking twist. Story 32, I objected, but before the wedding. Pleaded with a friend BC the girl was fucking nuts. 2 kids and 3 years later and they were divorced. Could have saved him a ton of money and stress if he hadn't been blinded by the boobies. Story 33. My cousin was planning wedding #3. I apologized to her mom, my auntie, that I wouldn't be able to attend. She replied, "Oh, don't worry, dear. You can come to the next one." Story 34. I went to an outrageous wedding at a nightclub where all the guests had to dress in something outrageous as well. It was a pretty wild night, just when the bride, Gypsy, was about to say I do. This guy bursts into the place, pushes through the crowd surrounding the bride and groom, throws her over his shoulder and runs off down the street with her, pink harem outfit flying. We never saw them again. The poor groom was in shock. Turned out to be her ex, and she actually ended up marrying him eventually. Lol. Meanwhile, the rest of us partied hard and consoled the groom with copious amounts of champagne and dancing. Best wedding ever. Story 35. My daughter just got married last week, and I asked the minster why he never asked that question. He explained to me that it isn't really asked anymore, for obvious reasons. He said too many people are doing it just to try to be internet famous, and most of the time don't even mean it. Story 36. All experienced officiants know that you don't ask, does anybody object? You ask, does anyone know any reason that these 2 people may not lawfully be joined in marriage? Story 37. Not an objector. But I was at this one where the best man showed up late to the wedding and professed his love for the MOH. MOH, who gave me douchey vibes, confronts him, but MOH then tells her that she's not actually in love with. BF then tried to fight the guy, but the groom knocked him out. Found out later that MOH and douchey were actually engaged and that douchey had been sneaking around behind her back. Crazy stuff. Story 38. Funny story. My husband was the best man for his cousin with the wedding taking place in Scotland. I am in the audience with my in-laws and my 13-month-old son. He was being really good, but when it came to the vows, I gave him a bottle to keep him super quiet. At the point when the minister asked if there were any objections, and there was that small bit of silence, my son took out his bottle out of his mouth and said, Everyone laughed and the minister said, I'll no take that as an objection. I quickly picked him up and carried him out of the church. Everyone came up later and said that he was such a good boy. Fortunately, the bride and groom thought it was very funny. Story 39. So a group of guys were going to do this at a friend's wedding until we were told that if someone objects, even jokingly, that the service was to be stopped ASAP. Husband-to-be, and the wife-to-be at the time, knew what we were doing and had to ask us to stop, which no one had an issue with, especially with that news being brought to our attention. Also thought it was an isolated incident or out friend was screwing with us, but have heard from other wedding officiants that it is a thing. Story 40. I was 10, and this relative said something like she was going to say something but didn't. She was objecting to something so minor that we all shrugged. Story 41. I wasn't there but heard the story. The daughter of old family friends was getting married. Her father was a real jokester. When the officiant asked if anyone objects, the father said, I do, pause. I've always wanted to do that. Everyone laughed and the wedding continued. I'm told the bride and groom were not angry and also laughed. Story 42. No public objection, but it was really clear the mother of the groom was not excited and did not approve. Like, I didn't even know the family very well and all, and could see the sharp, pointy rocks ahead. Story 43. I went to a wedding that was heavily objected to for so many reasons. Everyone wanted to say it, but nobody indicated they were going to. When the time actually came, they fucking left that part out of the ceremony. I think that might be more normal now, but it definitely wasn't then, and I'm sure they took steps to make sure it was omitted. The wedding blew up worse than any reality show I've ever seen, so we didn't leave empty-handed. Story 44. Not the wedding, but rehearsal dinner. Mother of groom was fairly drunk and her toast ended with, she's a dirty who doesn't deserve my baby. She was not invited to the wedding after that. Story 45. My father was a pastor. It happened once during a wedding he was performing. A woman stood up and said that the groom could not get married because he was already married and she was his wife. Dad canceled the wedding. Story 46. At my wedding, my nephew was our ring bearer. During the part where the priest asked if anyone objected to this wedding, he moaned out loud, I'm too young to get married. This was followed by heartbroken sobs. It turns out that the whole tuxedo thing, along with his matching pocket watch, similar to what I got for my husband, was just too much for him. He thought that he was marrying me too, and he definitely didn't want to. Story 47. As a joke at that point, all the groomsmen said wait, and turned in their keys to her apartment, and said something like, I guess we better give our keys back. Story 48. Yeah, I had this happen at my own wedding. A woman I'd not had anything to do with in any romantic sense yelled out, I object. He should be marrying me, not her. This was followed by some hilarious shenanigans my ex-wife dined out on for a very long time. Story 49. It's got an interesting history. If someone knew a member of the couple to be already married, underage, unbaptized, church law, or forcefully coerced into the union, it was considered their duty to object. The same was true if they knew the couple to be too closely related by blood. Story 50. Around 20 years ago, my son and I met a guy who had fallen hard for a girl at his temp job. He got pretty down because she was practically engaged. Day of the wedding comes, and he bursts into the church screaming he objects. Long story short, his best friend's girlfriend, a real dragon of a lady, ate the groom. Later, he and the girl got married. Story 51. This question is never actually asked at weddings, and when it is, it's typically done in satirical fashion. Also, if somebody actually objected, they would more than likely be escorted out. Weddings are fucking expensive, with many times dozens of people orchestrating the event. Catering, flowers, music, officiating, logistics, etc., etc. To wait to the day of to ruin such an even is a massive move. Either talk to them before the check's clear, or stay the home. Story 52. Not an official objection, but when the pastor asked for objections when my mother married her husband, my aunt, MOH, mom's friend, another bridesmaid, and my cousin, groomsman, all looked at me. I didn't approve, but I knew she still would have done it. He was an abusive. Story 54. I saw a blonde appear out of the curtains. Seems that she was uninvited by the lovely bride-to-be. Her hands were shaking. Everyone had horrified looks on their faces. She only looked at the groom. Story 55. I don't have any really good stories, but twice in the last 3 weeks, I've had reservations, fine dining, where a proposal was supposed to happen and didn't, and another where the whole post-proposal dinner was canceled. Like, Story 56. A wedding I attend where I was fully aware that the groom had boned my other associate's roommate the night before, she was not the bride, hit the point where the officiant asked any objection, and thunder pealed and it started raining. I have never laughed so hard in all my life. Story 57. Why on earth would anyone include this question in their wedding ceremony? Because honestly, if somebody does have a reason why these two should not be joined, bringing it up for the first time in the middle of the ceremony is considered a move in bird culture. Story 58. Wife put her fiancé's side chick's earrings in the ring box, and when he opened it, he just went, oh. Then the bride told everyone he was cheating on her, and her mom beat up the groom. Groom ended up leaving wedding in an ambulance. Story 59. No one objected, but we were at a friend's wedding, his first of 3, but no one liked the bride. She was nothing but drama and problems, but no one said anything. But when they said the wedding vows, another buddy of ours leaned over once the vows were over and said, I you not, my wristwatch stopped once the vows started and started back up once the vows ended. They were divorced after a couple years. Her crazy was too fucking much. Story 60. Not during the ceremony, but as my dad and I lined up outside the doors for my big entry, he said, Are you sure about this? It's not too late to cancel. Wish I'd listened. Story 61. Not quite, but I asked my brother if he was absolutely sure he wanted to do this, right before his courthouse wedding. He gave me an entirely unconvincing yes as we walked to the courthouse. We don't talk anymore, and he cut himself off from the family. It isn't great. Story 62. You decide. A friend was working at Marvel Comics when the first few movies were released. Iron Man, Incredible Hulk, Thor, and it was rainy on his wedding day. When the officiant asked, if anyone should object to this union, let them speak now or forever hold their peace. Lightning struck pretty close to the venue, and a loud thundercrack shook the whole chapel. Everyone had a good laugh, and lots of Thor jokes were made at the reception. Story 63. Oh, I can do this one. The husband's mother said, well, no, because I've already paid for the wedding, but you all just wait. This was 3 months after the big 2019 20th fires in our town in NSW, Australia. It was funny because at every point during the wedding and reception, the wife's mother would thank the fire brigade captain and his second in charge, my husband. Well, not even a month late, the couple had filed for divorce, and the bride had been sleeping with the fire captain, 45 years her senior. The husband, wife, and all of the husband's family knew, but the wife promised to not sleep with the captain but wanted to remain his friend, so he was still at the wedding. Story 64. I wasn't there in person, but when my father got married to his final wife, the bride's daughter objected because he hadn't been saved by Jesus. So my dad had to, pretend accept Jesus at his wedding, in order to go on without offending the bride's whole family. This was a moment he complained about twice a week every week since it occurred. He never got over it, and became socially hostile to his wife's adult children whenever he was afforded the opportunity. I've come to the conclusion that there's literally no good reason to object to a wedding at the wedding. You're literally just telling the people who invited you there that your thoughts are more important than them on their wedding day. If you have an objection, object in private. And if then the wedding happens anyway, go or don't. But standing on a soapbox at someone else's wedding is just going to cause grief, full stop. You're at the wedding, it's too late. You're not the protagonist. It's not about you. My dad was I'm not trying to excuse his behavior, but I understand why he felt slighted. Besides, the woman he was marrying that day broke up with him when he was younger for being white because her family and friends told her not to mix. My stepmom is black. So it must have felt like her family was always trying to have a say in who she was allowed to associate with, which kind of feels messed up. Story 65. No, but I saw the mother of the groom suddenly lose it during the father of the bride's speech during the reception. Much sobbing about how the bride wasn't good enough for her son, how special he was because he had a metallurgy bachelor's, and how his life was now ruined. My girlfriend's dad calmed her down and took her to another room, during which 30-ish% of the guests left to escape the drama. It was a pretty brutal day. Story 66. Nostalgia. This is one of the first AskReddit threads I can remember reading on this godforsaken site when I stumbled on it more than 13 years ago. Story 67. At my sister's first wedding, I was maid of honor and my husband was best man, and after the ceremony, my sister and new husband turned to walk back down the aisle, and I was watching my husband, and he had turned around and just kept standing and staring, and I kept thinking, go! And I can't believe that he's ruining her wedding, but I looked out and saw the reason for it. At the bottom of the steps was this raggedy-looking blonde with a kid about 2, I think, splayed out in her arms, standing in front of my sister, and him, and she tossed that baby, she threw it actually, at the groom, which gave my sister the opportunity to draw back her fist, and she punched her square in the jaw. But it only rocked because she was pretty, stout. And then my sister took the child and handed him back to her, and I ran down there, and what caught me first was the awful smell. It was part wet diaper, but mostly like opening a dumpster on a really hot day. And then the face of the kid, it was so filthy with fresh snot and old dried caked on snot covering his nose and mouth. It was so sad, and he just laid there while the mother screamed into my sister's face that the groom, Rob, had told her that he didn't want to get married because he still loved her. But my sister just pushed by her, dragging Rob down the aisle, and the music started back up, and the rest of the wedding party lined back up and filed past the dirty floozy. And some of us, like my mom and family friends, took her outside and asked her what was going on. And she said that Rob had spent the night with her and told her all about how the wedding was going to be a huge mistake because he wanted to be with her and his child, which none of us even knew he had a kid, including my sister. But a few months later, she sued him for child support, but by then my sister was already pregnant. It turned out that everything she said was true, and Rob had known she would come to stop the wedding, and he had all his friends sitting in the back of the church to keep her out, but she stormed right by them. It was a total nightmare having to go face most of our family and friends at the reception, but you better believe they all showed up LOL. Story 68. My cousin was marrying a man she'd known, in total, less than 6 months. I told her relationships tended to end at the 1-5 year mark, and she should consider having an engagement last at least that long. I couldn't morally attend the wedding for that reason. Turns out 0 people attended that day. The entire relationship from beginning to end was 1-5 years. Story 69. I married my second wife in a judge's office. The only guests were her parents and mine. Right before the ceremony, her mom said to me, "Are you sure you want to do this?" right in front of her. They didn't speak for a couple of years. Mill was right. When wife #2 filed for divorce 7 years later, her parents showed up for a sit-down, and her stepdad called her the most conniving and manipulative person I know. Story 70. I have been to a few weddings where someone thought it would be funny. It was usually a baby boomer, and it was way more awkward than they thought. In 2 cases, they were escorted out, and the police had to be called when they refused to leave. In almost all cases, the people getting married went no contact with them after the vows were said. Just pretended they didn't exist at the reception, and they never got invited to any family events at their house. In one case, it was not a prank, more a skin tone issue. That didn't go well for the mother of the bride. She never got to see any of her grandchildren, even her other children's grandchildren.